Good evening, everybody. I'm Isla Berman, the Director of Architecture at CCA, and it's with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome Bernard Tschumi to CCA this evening and to introduce this evening's special event, which will be a conversation between Bernard Tschumi and Jasmine Benyamin on Bernard's writing, design, practice, and teaching, and on the relationship between his own work and the work of his father, Jean Tschumi. This conversation, led by Jasmine, will cross between two books that we have available this evening, and we'll also have a continued book signing after the talk. The two books, Bernard Tschumi by Gilles Deboer and Jean Tschumi, Architecture at Full Scale by Jacques Gubler, both of which were translated and adapted into English by Jasmine Benyamin. Bernard Tschumi is the principal of Bernard Tschumi Architects of Paris and New York, and a professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, where he was the dean for 15 years. Bernard Tschumi's research in design, which has continuously challenged and expanded the edges of traditional architectural practice, was known early on for its radical posture in relation to the event. The reinvention of programmatic hybrids and urban choreographies that would instigate a violence in relation to the architectural object while dismantling both the functionalist utilitarian doctrines of modernism and the disciplinary autonomy of architectural artifacts. Early books and works by Tschumi, such as the Manhattan Transcripts of 1981 and Architecture in Disjunction of 1994, led to the later 3 volumes of Event Cities of 94, 2000, and 2005, each of which displayed the inseparability of elaborating a conceptual trajectory and the making of architectural work, while expanding the thesis that architecture's importance resides in its abilities to accelerate society's transformation through a careful agencing of spaces and events. The projects documented in Event Cities, which include large-scale urban projects such as Parc de la Villette in Paris, and the Lausanne Bridge City Project and Transit Center, as well as the urban architectures of Kyoto and the railway station and the Le Fresnoy Art Center in France, also call attention to another of Tschumi's critical theses, that architecture's importance is in its ability to be a city generator that strategically engages, challenges, activates, and redefines its urban context. Tschumi's many significant works, in addition to those mentioned, include the Lerner Student Center at Columbia University, the Athletic Center that's pictured on the cover of the Burkhauser book at the University of Cincinnati, the Limoges Concert Hall in France, and the recently completed New Acropolis Museum in Athens. In addition to his own books and numerous publications on his work, Tschumi has also been the honored recipient of countless international competition awards. Bernard Tschumi has certainly become one of the most renowned architectural figures of his generation, and we're very excited that he's able to join us this evening. Jasmine Benyamin, who will be Bernard's conversant this evening, is an adjunct professor in architecture and visual studies at California College of the Arts. Jasmine is also a recipient of many awards, including an Andrew Mellon Foundation grant, a Canadian Center for Architecture Collection Research grant, that is the other CCA, as well as DAAD and Fulbright fellowships for her research in Germany. Jasmine is also the editor and translator of numerous books on architecture, including the recently published monographs on Bernard Tschumi and Jean Tschumi. Jasmine holds bachelor's degrees in architecture and French literature from Columbia University, a Master of Architecture degree from Yale, and is currently a PhD candidate in architectural history and theory at Princeton University. Her research examines the role of photography in German architectural discourse in the early part of this 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Bernard Tschumi and Jasmine Benyamin this evening.
Can we move this a little bit? Can we move this back? Can we? Is it stuck? Starting at hemmed in. All right. Is that better? Welcome, everyone. First, my thanks to Isla Berman for her encouragement and support in putting this event together. Bill Stout for the coordination of the 2 volumes, as well as other volumes. tonight for tonight's book signing. Special thanks to Thomas Landry in the Architecture Department for his ceaseless answers to my ceaseless emails about this event, and his generosity and patience with setting up everything to do with this event. But most of all, thanks to Bernard for making a special trip to CCA, in fact, less than 24 hours in San Francisco, to join in this conversation. I don't know if you have any opening.
Well, this moment of thanks, I have just to express my pleasure in being here. You have a fantastic building. I've been incredibly impressed and very jealous retroactively. I was a dean for many years, but your space is a lot better than the one I ever had. But, of course, I want to thank Jasmine Benjamin, who has done an extraordinary work. You have no idea how difficult it is. It's not a question of translation, but it's a question of understanding the nature of thought and turning it into something which is just as precise, but actually quite different. And she's been remarkable, and I thank you for organizing this particular event.
Thank you. So to use some of your words, the environmental trigger, so to speak, for this event was our collaboration on the two books that Isla mentioned. The first one was the Burghäuser edition for Bernard's, we'll put monograph in quotes, and the second book would be the first ever, I believe, monograph translated from French by Jacques Hubler on his father's work, Jean Tschumi, and that's been published by Skira. So that was sort of the trigger. The format is a little unusual this time. I've never done this kind of thing before, but I was sort of inspired by your successor, Mark Wigley, talking about architecture as a conversation and architects as storytellers. So I thought, well, what better way to introduce your work and also your father's work to an audience that may not be familiar with much of it. And so we will begin with the question of the monograph itself. I guess I wonder what thoughts you have about the two books coming out in relatively the same period and how they function or not function as monographs in the traditional sense.
They come at the same moment totally by accident, of course. One is a very serious scholarly study by Jacques Hubler on an architect as, in a sense, representative of a whole period of the 20th, the first half of the 20th century. Namely, someone who studied in Paris at the Beaux-Arts in the 20s, then built, well, was active as a furniture designer, as an interior designer, because he couldn't find any work, you know, in terms of architectural work due to the war and so on. And then eventually, during a very short period of time, designed 6 buildings of a very high modernist sort of sensibility, and then died at the age of 57, too early in a sense to be able to fully develop what could have been, but has done quite remarkable buildings. So that's a very serious, very, very serious study. And for many years I was thinking, hey, we ought to do something, and then Hubler, the scholar, was able to do so, and we had all the archives. So that's one type of work which really talks about the movement from the Beaux-Arts to an influence of American architecture on European architects, and then, you know, the work itself. The book that is around Bernard is really totally different. Not scholarly at all, very journalistic, not theoretical, really aimed at quite a different audience, more at a larger, and amusingly enough, the fact that it is in English is really an accident. I'm not supposed to tell you, but I really didn't want it to be translated. And the...
You didn't.
I can't go into many details. In any case, it was a book, because of its journalistic nature, that I thought is just for a French audience. You're going to get me talk too much. The French are not very theoretical, despite what you may think. The Americans are far more interested in ideas. The French architects like images more than words. So in that particular case, the book, De Buur's book on me was about, telling things in an easy way. And it turned out that the publisher, unbeknownst to me, I didn't read the fine print in my contract, wanted to publish it in English. So at that time, I was completely panicking. And we really did need somebody very good. Hence, Jasmine, who I knew already anyway. So that's what I want to say about the difference between the two books. They're actually very good, but they're very different from one another. Monograph, yes, the Jean Tschumi is a monograph. The other one is storytelling. I've always been reluctant about monograph, as you might know. I happen to think that books... Well, I may change now, but I used to say that a book ought to have an agenda, that a book ought to try to defend a set of ideas, and I still believe that. In other words, books that I hope to put out, a few years, not years, but maybe a year from now, will be again this type of book with an agenda, with the Gilles de Buur book on Bernard Tschumi is in a way a shortcut, a journalistic shortcut, and a good one at that. The book on Jean Tschumi is very, very specific and quite informative about really the period as a whole.
I know you've always expressed a concern about the monograph's power to create this kind of false hegemony or sort of false unity in someone's oeuvre, and that in fact the narrative is much more complicated than that, and in a sense it functions that way because it's so anecdotal and it's journalistic. It's a series of episodes that have been recounted, right?
Well, I think you're hinting at something which is very important, is about the relationship between books and architects or architecture. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether we should start in the last 20 years, say with SMLXL, right? Or should we start further back with Complexity and Contradiction with Venturi, or even further back, with Korb, who was just as much of a journalist as an architect in many ways, or should we start even further back with Palladio and the 10 books? In other words, there is always a correlation between the world of ideas in architecture and the books that are being produced. But it's not only about ideas. There are some architects who don't write, but their publication are crucial. Say, look, I don't think that Mies was an architect as a writer. Right. However, it's the few publication, or even when he worked, as the editor of a magazine, that somehow the transmission of the work was really happening. Mm-hmm.
Well, on the subject of writing, I think we could sort of dive in. This is an image from Screenplays from 1976. Writing, and indeed all its semiotic corollaries, scripting, narratives, seems to have played an important role in the development of your practice. Early in your career, especially when you weren't building yet, writing was central to your work. And I wonder through this image if you could expand a little bit on the function of the written word for you in relation to the images.
Well, now we get into history, right? And it's well, one reason to have anxieties about monographs, and by the way, anxieties about this evening, you know, the fact of sort of mapping my work with my own father, you can imagine the Freudian aspect of that, but we'll leave that aside. Let's say, I'm of a generation that certainly was very much, either directly or indirectly, very much struck by the general questioning that took place around the '68 period. Some of us were more politically involved, others less, but nevertheless the spirit of the time, which happened in a lot of disciplines, not only in architecture, in literature, in art in general, in filmmaking, was such that it was impossible to graduate and then immediately start to work, you know, to try to build up your own office. First, there was not too much work. There was a recession which was probably even worse than the one right now. And secondly, nobody believed in anything anymore, right? So hence, there was an attempt to reformulate certain things. And many of us did spend time looking elsewhere, looking at other disciplines, many of us taught. I think teaching was a very good place because universities or schools are really the only place where one could have a sort of freedom in exploring, expressing things. So in that context, I would write just asking those questions. And at one moment, I also saw the limits of words. There's only so much you can say with words. So if you're an architect, there's a moment when you use signs, diagrams, right, to try to express ideas. I was also fascinated by film because for some reason I felt that there was really an exploration of space, of movement of bodies in space, and maybe I didn't know that, yeah, I knew somehow a fair amount about architecture, but I was really interested in what other disciplines could say about it. And take this drawing. I even have my little pointer.
Oh, look, very
these are excerpts from a movie, a B movie, Dr. Frankenstein. And this is the doctor, this is the monster. And they get at one moment in a fight. And I was interested in the movement, the body movements, and started to map the choreography of, you know, the emotions, and said, okay, that's the motion, and then let's solidify the motion, let's turn it into a solid, and then make of that positive solid a negative figure, i.e. a space, so that we have the space of the fight. And that relationship between movement and space was really, I thought, really important. Also important was the fact that you could establish a relationship between film and architecture. In other words, saying that architecture had nothing to do with what certain people used to call autonomy. In other words, architecture as form that is only informed by its own history, but that architecture was really part of culture, and architecture was not about knowledge of form, but was a form of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. I think Manhattan Transcripts, just in the title itself, transcript, indicates also a kind of textual inclination, but always with images that are both drawn by you and imported from film, from dance, from other disciplines. I wonder if you could go a little bit into what was going on here. This is Manhattan Transcripts, the park, so one section of it.
Around the same time as I was doing those screenplays of the image you just saw before, the screenplays, as I would say, they were exercises like I would do them in a night. Generally, I had an old Zenith television set, a really big box. Zenith. And I would be working, drawing, and testing with those film excerpts. I would sort of test certain things. but they would be very quick, again, in one night. The Manhattan.
We have a request that we need to speak closer into the
Oh,
mic.
I'm
People
sorry.
are being deprived from.
Probably in another
Yes,
room,
there.
right? Okay, I apologize.
No.
So the transcripts was a much longer affair. In other words, eventually it took me about 4 years to do the 4 episodes, 1 per year. And here the idea was far more ambitious. It was trying to see how a city, it could have been a generic city, but of course Manhattan had a particular fascination. A city at the time, and again I have to get back to a little bit of history. Cities in the late 70s were bad. Everybody hated cities. One talked about how people were leaving cities. Sociologists were writing books about the city was gone, right? Especially the inner city. And some of us liked cities, and certainly, in a way, this exploration, this fascination with the archetypal typologies of, the street, the park, the tower, the block. Each of these were really things meant to be explored. And in the case of the transcript, again, back to that notion that architecture is about movement and event, I developed a mode of notation which always was that tripartite mode of notation where you would have action, what happens. Eventually you can call that the program. And then secondly, the plans themselves and the movement of the different protagonists in the action. So this form of notation was quite important to me because I always felt that architectural plans and sections and axonometric and perspectives, however sophisticated they are, they do not tell you what happens in the space and do not tell you how people move about. And this is really just as much part of architecture as, your usual interpretation of a neutral space. Look, for example, I understand this was a Greyhound bus terminal. I tell you, that's not the same building anymore.
If we shift for a minute we'll get back to the question of politics and event spaces, but I wanted to talk a little bit about writing's corollary, which is drawing. And to begin with a few drawings of your father's. Your father, Jean Tschumi, seemed to favor drawing to writing quite a bit. And we could talk a little bit, if you'd like, about to what we could owe that difference in emphasis. Is it an institutional upbringing? Is it a particular era? But in any case, there was a plenitude of this kind of a drawing in particular, which was a kind of sketch on trace. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on his process.
Yeah, you asked me, whether it was an upbringing or whether inclination.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, it's really important. This type of thing, and I'm sure it happens to some of you in the room. In the case of my father, Jean Tschumi was born out of a very simple family. His father was a furniture maker, but not in the sense of literally working with a woodworker, right? And then Jean Tschumi went at age 17 to the École des Beaux-Arts, so didn't have much of a, just hardly out of high school, immediately went into professional schools. No development of, undergraduate program of this sort. It was another era. And in order to find money to study, worked in architectural offices as a draftsman, right? So it's a very different situation from someone who goes to high school and then even comes to America as an exchange student. That's my case, in the early 60s, and then has a fairly comprehensive education, like many of you in this room. So I think it's a very, very different thing. And I could say that indeed you have different mode of expression. And I was certainly more secure at the time using words than using the lines, drawings. And in this particular case, Jean Tschumi was certainly more secure using drawing and extraordinarily good at it. There are a number of things even to this day, I could never emulate. And by the way, this is an interesting thing. Yeah. These are plans for master plan for Stockholm, a competition. In that also Le Corbusier participated in this competition. Right. Both my father and Le Corbusier were eliminated on the first round for being too utopian. Amusingly enough, we'll see what happens, but the Museum of Modern Art is really interested in that set of drawing because it's 1932, which is a special date. It's the foundation of MoMA. In any case, so that's very early work and quite interesting in this respect, but historically there's another thing that interests me personally as an architect. It's the way you have different versions of the same drawings, which are really about what we call partie today, as opposed to what we would call diagram, in our, current generation. So there is something, one which is intensely compositional, and I don't mean it in a negative sense. It's a very interesting period of history, 19th and early 20th century, while today architects work slightly different. Not all of them, by the way. I would say that, Tom Mayne or Zaha Hadid are compositional, while others like Koolhaas or myself are much more diagrammatic.
The next two slides will be sort of comparisons between two sets of drawings or two examples of drawings. On the one hand, a study that your father did for Paris Souterrain, underground Paris, in 1937, compared to the La Villette blowout axonometric superpositioning of points, lines, and planes. And I think that this might be a good place also to elaborate further on these definitions, partie, concept, and diagram.
Let's put it this way. This drawing, which probably is one of the better known drawing I've done, for me was very straightforward. It's a superimposition of planes where people can appropriate whatever space they want. The points, which are about points of intensities, they're the markers at La Villette, and then the movement vectors, the lines. So it was point, lines, surfaces. So very important drawing for me for many years. And when Jacques Gubler, the scholar who wrote about Jean Tschumi, started to put all the archives together, at one moment I see the proofs of the text before the book on Jean Tschumi goes to the printer. Actually, I see it probably at the same time as you see it, yes. Right? And suddenly I see this drawing. And I completely freak out. I say, wow,
he's a nice moment.
He's done it before me. And that was very interesting. In reality, what it was indeed a series of layers. And these layers were trying to explain how to build a model of that underground Paris. And this is really a model which was made of different layers that were superimposed over one another with light coming from below. So for an exhibition, and the general public could understand how those different layers worked. So it's not quite the same, but that the notion of superimposition, which is so important to me, was in that model, and I loved it, and I couldn't resist telling Jasmine, oh, please include it.
I oblige. The next comparison, I think, is particularly interesting in bringing up this issue of la variante, or the variant, which was a concept that Jacques Gubler outlined in his monograph on your father's work, comparing la variante, the variant, to the combinatorial language set up perhaps as an example by the concepts of large-scale organization.
This is, again, here I feel like we are almost having a conversation between two teachers. In other words, hey, saying there are no right and wrong, but there are different ways to do things. There's not only one type of an architect, there are different type of architects, and there are different ways to read architecture over the years, the centuries, the generations. In this particular case, that's again, this I don't even know, I can't remember which project it is. I'm trying to...
It's the veterinary hospital.
Yes, right, okay, yeah. So, architects trained really throughout the first half of the 20th century were really talking about something they called composition. And they considered the school at the Beaux-Arts in Paris the best school of composition in the world. Actually, the word composition, I remember being asked, I used to attack composition enormously as a young architect, and one time doing so at a lecture at Harvard at GSD, where they were learning composition, that's about 10, 15 years ago, I think it was Scott Cohen who said, oh, composition is so important, how can you deny it? I said, well, maybe the world has changed and it's not anymore about these harmony and balance, and it's about disjunction and things of this sort, but also very much about an analytical approach to the work. And this is quite, you know what these drawings are? These are the very first sketches I did when I started to do the La Villette competition. I received those 500 pages of the program, and the first thing I did was, hey, you have a large space, you have 125 acres, how do you organize territories? And started to do, you know, the grid, the concentric, the axis, and all this sort of thing, or even adding things like Collage City, or like Malevich, or Hilbershammer, and even this one, right? You see the point grid of Le Corbusier suddenly peaking its ugly eye, you know, so, okay?
Rearing its head,
right.
Yes. I think we'll return to La Villette with a discussion of event space. I think it's quite critical because it's sort of the centerpiece of the discourse that you created and elaborated on in Event Cities, but that there's a prehistory to Event Cities, which is this more generalized event space. And I wonder if we could actually begin with this image from Advertisements for Architecture as an introduction to the notion of event.
First, I should simply explain what those advertisements for architecture are.
Yes.
I was being asked to do, again, as I mentioned earlier, I knew how to write better than I knew how to do projects, so, or also I was reluctant to do projects, that's even more important. I was, so whenever I would write an article for magazines, I would ask them whether I could do an ad. And in other words, doing those advertisements for architecture. Architecture also, I have to say, at the time was very unpopular. Namely, I was living in England, and a friend of mine, a very good architect, told me, listen, don't call yourself an architect. Architects are the one who design social housing and places where little old ladies get stuck on the 20th floor when the elevator breaks down. You have to call yourself a designer. And so I thought we have to, you know, do those advertisements in favor of architecture, and they were, of course, horribly critical. They were about decay and about, indeed, disruptions and things like that. And that was one of them as part of the series which try to, as you can read in the at the bottom, I don't know if you can read it, architecture is defined by the action it witnesses as much as by the enclosure of its walls. In other words, saying that there is no architecture without something that happens in it. And this was really important as an awareness. Just as I said earlier, this building, your building you are in, is entirely different today as a place of education organized in the way it is as from what it was when it was, you know, a bus depot.
If we move from a bus depot to a slaughterhouse, the sketches for La Villette, I think, also potentially bring up the embodiment of event space in the drawings themselves. And so these examples, I think.
Well, this is exactly, if the previous drawing
yes.
On the right was the very first drawing of La Villette, this is the second one. Right. It was simply taking each of those, you know, the grid or the axis or the point grid, taking them and putting them on the site. And here it's even superimposing Central Park on the La Villette site. And amusingly enough, on doing this fairly mechanical set of permutations, I discovered ahead of time the project of many of the competitors of the project, of the La Villette competition. If any of you know the entries of some of my friends and colleagues, you know, Zaha Hadid, or I think that was, yeah, there were several like that. And here you may recognize Rem Koolhaas. So hence this rather objective way to look at it, slightly detached, is very much the way I would start project, and I have to say I still do. And then there is a moment when inevitably you start to be more subjective in the way you work. But early in the process, it's always ruthlessly objective. And then eventually, you know, I was really interested in that notion of the object in space, as opposed to, well, object in space is, I would say, fairly easy to understand in an American context, but in a European context where everybody speaks about plaza and streets, to speak about autonomous objects was something quite provocative, and hence the beginning of the La Villette competition.
It's interesting that the emphasis, I think, on those two words, object and space, would be equal. In other words, that there was a movement from objects to a larger notion of a field or a terrain, and that the project ended up being neither object nor field, but a negotiation between the two.
Do you know something? Today I went to one of the most fantastic bookstores in the world, you know, Bill Stout. And I wrote down that I had to, the book was too thick for me to carry with me, right? And it said Ramplan versus Plan Libre, right? And I have to buy that book. And I'll order it from you, Bill, if you're here. And Ramplan, if I translate it into English, means spatial plan, that is defining the spaces through the walls. A very Germanic way to do things. Then the Plan Libre, the free plan of Le Corbusier, is really about, you know, the grid of columns, for example, and the movements in a free way around it. So this opposition between object and space is a very important one throughout the history of architecture. I'll give you another example. Those of you who know that book by Colin Rowe called Collage City, there is an amazing juxtaposition where on one side you see a city, probably Rome, with all its street and piazzas, and on the other side you see Le Corbusier Plan Voisin with all its towers on a grid for Paris. And of course, he hates the Le Corbusier plan voisin and loves the continuity of spaces and street and plazas and colonnade. And generally, space is meant to be continuous, object is meant to be discontinuous, but in reality, the two are totally interrelated, and you cannot separate them. And in a way, the discussion of La Villette had to do with that question of that interrelationship.
And it seems that the mechanism to negotiate between those two terms is, in fact, the action within the space.
Or the program, if you want. If you know, program is really a major issue. Yeah.
On the subject of program, I think it's, I wonder if you could elaborate to what degree are the terms interchangeable? In other words, event and use, event and function, event and program, are they equally weighted?
That's either you know too much, or
I don't know.
or it's a crucial. Okay, here is the story. That's about 12 years ago. I was invited, and I was to do a double act with Jacques Derrida in front of an audience of over 1,000 people. Right. And I was absolutely terrified because I had then been living for about, well, almost, exactly 20 years in the US. And while my French was quite good for everyday sort of ordering the bread and negotiating a contract, was really I was not sure if I could spend an hour in front of a large audience debating ideas with Derrida.
That goes for a lot of people, I imagine.
So I start, and luckily enough, probably you all know when it's like an actor, when anxiety helps you to concentrate and to focus. And the discussion went very well, and it was actually a very exciting moment. But at one moment, Jacques Derrida tells me, Bernard, you use the word function, the word program, the word use, the word event, in a somehow imprecise manner. Of course, he's a philosopher, he uses words. And he points out something very important, which of course I've repeated ever again, right? Is that a program is something that is repeated, which is part of the realm of habit. That's why we architects get a program. So you know that you get so many square meters, so many square feet of living room, or of bathroom, or of auditorium, or of lobby, and so on. Because these are well-known, activities, you know how much space they need. So it's a question of habit. However, an event is very different. An event is something that happens because it's somehow unexpected or unprecedented. And one of the things that is indeed interesting about architecture is when it creates, when it generates, or when it, how could I say, when it contributes, that's more precise, contributes to events. And so that distinction is really something that was in the background of La Villette, to which extent that superimposition of point lines and surfaces would create unexpected encounters between different groups of people, between, if you were ever interested in surrealism, you know the famous statement of the meeting of the bicycle, the sewing machine on the dissecting table. And so this, in a way, it's about unexpected encounters, and that's what the Park of La Villette was about.
Maybe to round out the event part of this discussion, I found these particularly fascinating. The idea that you had actually designed the fireworks and done these preparatory drawings for this fireworks in 1989, superimposed on the existing point lines grid of La Villette. I wonder if you could elaborate on this drawing and how it came about.
Well, the very first, in a way, manifesto at the time, it was one was
You're
trying.
speeding up, Bernard. We're not there yet.
Well,
Manifesto.
Right?
We're not there yet. Oh,
Okay.
no,
Doesn't
it's
matter.
okay. You can say
So
the
I'll
word.
come back. Okay. I'll just say, the very first was about fireworks. I like the idea of fireworks because I was saying fireworks are useless. You know, you burn energy and it's absolutely useless. So, very unfashionable
But
today,
very beautiful.
right? Okay. 10 years later, I'm asked to to organize a firework at La Villette. So I say, oh, I'd love to. And so I
Design
call
fireworks,
and I
fantastic.
ask the firework people, do you have any examples of firework notation, like there's music notation or there are, you know, film scripts and so. And they say, no, you just explain. And I say, I don't know how to do that. So I'm going to invent a mode of notation for firework. Just so, here it is. So I, with one person in the office, we started to develop a system of score every 7 seconds, right? And then you have the three-dimensional view, you have the plan view, you have the section view, you have the noise level, you have the intensity. Okay. So we prepared that, and there was 264 of those things multiplied by 7 seconds, gave you the length of the firework.
What was the music? Was there any music? Or?
No, the sound of the fireworks is so loud that you can't hear the music, right? So I sent it to the firework manufacturer. And
He must have been very confused.
And no response, nothing. So I called and I said, did you see? Did you like it? And they say, we didn't understand a thing. You know, can you just tell us in simple words what you really want? You mean just a white line, 4 red dots, and then blue. And then I said, yeah, that's what I mean. And so we worked like that, and so they did that, and so here.
Well, it's pretty remarkable how close it is to the drawings. I mean, it's
The intention,
actually quite uncanny.
the intention was to do La Villette is of course a large horizontal plane, and to do La Villette 3-dimensionally. In other words, that you can have the greater follies continuing in the sky.
The endless axonometric.
That's right.
So manifestos. Now we can embark. I put an image. This is a agent provocateur of an image from May 1968. Because you've stated on numerous occasions and in our conversations, in fact, that your formative years in architecture were very much influenced by the events of May in 1968. And not accidentally, there were many architectural manifestos that were sort of conceived at this time. I wonder if you could first, before we get into your own work, what this event signaled for you.
Well, I don't think that is that different from what happened in a number of developed countries, including here in the US, that at one moment the mix between the post-war transformation and the beginning of affluence on one hand, and on the other hand, an increased frustration on the part of a younger generation in terms of the aspiration and the ambition of what they considered as a very established type of existence. And so the events that happened here in the US were not that different in spirit of what happened in Paris. The violence was different. The violence here, of course, led to people being killed. In Europe, it meant that cities really transformed themselves for a period of a few weeks in a way which was absolutely fascinating for a young architect who loved cities because felt that it was, you know, part of the way architecture was to be read. And hence, it completely transformed the way one looked at the idea of public space. And it's interesting to look at it. I wouldn't have thought about it if you hadn't asked the question, is the fact that the difference between public space and private space and the privatization of public space, which is a big issue today, where people who, you know, now most of the malls and or some parts of meeting spaces, Lincoln Square Center in New York, or I'm sure here in San Francisco near the your convention center, you're not sure whether it's a public space or a private space, which is simply let to the public, but with a lot of restrictions.
Mm-hmm. And you actually pointed me to this early project, or was it rather a series of projects that were then put together in book form that had the title, actually had the title Manifesto in them and incorporated the advertisements as part. Could you elaborate maybe on the role of just the notion or the concept of manifesto in this period for your work?
Well, you know, that's not only in this period. I would say today I continue to consider, whether it's in my own work or when I teach or when I have discussions with friends, is that architecture is about ideas. It's about, you know, saying something. It's not just making a shape. So in other words, at that time, since I was not doing buildings, they were sentences like, you know, again, this one is about imports. Here, talking about architecture, import and exports, and looking at things that were done by filmmakers and transposing, to, you know, translating them in architecture. Or in this particular case, this is a film. This is an image taken from, I believe, a Hitchcock. No, I'm not even sure. I can't remember. It's called the film was called The High Window. It's not a Hitchcock film. Well, you should know that.
I should, yeah.
You will. And or in this particular case, that was a firework done in relationship
that was the
to a
rehearsal
text.
for your fireworks.
Yeah, that was the very early fireworks. I mean, really pathetic. This one was sort of about this big, right, as opposed to going up in the sky. Right. Anyway.
It was interesting in our conversations that you mentioned your father's project going back to Paris Souterrain, Paris Underground. You mentioned this project in relation to the notion of manifesto, and I wonder if you could elaborate on why that is.
You all know that great architectural projects do not necessarily have to be built, right? And we all have, well, you know that.
We're trying to get them to build.
If you think, looking around, at least I'll take my own generation, right? But that applies to any of you in the audience. Between the moment when people started to hear about Zaha Hadid, or started to hear about Rem Koolhaas, or hear about Tom Mayne, the work that they were doing took about 10 to 15 years before they were being built, right? Or, in other words, that's a long time, 15 years. It's like almost like the length of a generation. Or in architecture, the number of amazingly important projects of a utopian nature, which are still today, you know, somehow something we look at with fascination. 18th century, Boulez, Ledoux, Lequeux are always the scholarly example, but there are many others. So hence, or more recently in the 70s, Superstudio and Archizoom, these projects are really either were never meant to be built or were simply so much in advance that they could not be built at the time. In this particular case, I was fascinated to see this project, which would be very, very hard to build, of a very huge dome underneath the main, one of the largest square in Paris, the Place de la Concorde, and doing this, how would you call that, like a highway junction underneath the ground, and with transfer between roads and so on. So that's, for me, that's also the dimension of manifestos. That is, project or drawings that are there to communicate an idea, even though they go far beyond the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, that seems inherent in the word manifesto itself, that there's a political valence inherent in that word, and the basis for a manifesto is a critique on some level of existing conditions, and I wonder if we could sort of I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether you think that manifestos are still relevant today. I think you answered that question already, but what do you see as the site of resistance or for resistance in architectural practice today?
This is a very big question.
Yes.
First, the thing that whether manifestos are of any significance today.
Yeah.
10, 15 years ago, or even more, I mean, when I was doing them, that's more like 20, 25 years ago, a long time now. People were saying, "Oh, manifestos were important in the 20s, right? Or the Futurist Manifesto, 1912, right? 1911. But today, the avant-garde, it was over. And we were in different time, and it didn't mean anything to do manifestos." I happen to think that manifestos are very short formulation, very, very precise formulation of an idea, of an intention, of something that excludes as much as it proposes. I think that's still valid today. Or to say that, the avant-garde, it's all over. No, there are a number of issues which are constantly to reinvent or to invent new. One of the fascination that I have about architecture is that it's never an old art. Things are always changing. It's not only the fact, well, take example, 19th century invention of the elevator and new densities of the development of the metropolis creates a new type, the skyscraper. Today, the whole discussion on global warming, a lot of issues on green architecture are absolutely filled with bullshit. And at the same time, there is a real serious issue which is happening, in terms of our changing circumstances. So hence, it is a moment when people can propose and offer new attitudes. And why not? The manifesto is a mode of expression.
I guess I asked the question because it seems that there's a lot of, there are many projects and practices today that present their work in a very politically uncomplicated way or unproblematic way.
Of course, in the 1920s, after the Russian Revolution, enormously so, when avant-garde architects were saying that they could change society through architecture, and that architecture should sort of be the mirror of the society to come, so both the agent and the mirror of the new society. And then people, of course, stopped believing in it because it didn't quite work. Social housing with its tower block didn't make people happier and didn't make them more equal. So there was indeed a lot of flaws. And you show this image of Aldo Rossi at a time when the idea that architecture better stay silent was really a political statement of sort, right? And this idea of architectural autonomy and the idea of architecture as a series of types that had developed throughout history, but that could be totally indifferent to the political circumstances was very important. Just to quote some statement of the period, people used to say, there is no socialist architecture or no capitalist architecture. There is only architecture in a socialist regime or in a capitalist regime. So in other words, that architecture was totally independent from, politics. But today, just a few days ago, I read, the little magazine called Log. I read an article by Alessandro Zairapolo, who talks about envelopes and talks about large, type of malls, and about the fact that they completely, obliviate or completely close a piece of the territory of, and talks about porosity instead, and saying enclosing a space in this particular manner is political. I think the discussion is coming back.
It's good to hear. As a counterpoint to the Rossi example, it seemed that you gravitated much more towards, if not superstudio, this is an image from the Continuous Monument, just the word monument as a provocation, of course, in 1971, superimposed over New York City, but in particular, Archizoom. Archizoom's, again, another Italian example. All these guys are Italian. No Stop City from 1970. You saw as you very much part of your consciousness when you were thinking about La Villette. And before. Right.
But we continue that architecture and politics discussion.
Yes.
Again, at the time of intense questioning, what should architects do? We're not just form makers. We're just not doing pretty buildings. Many considered that it was a hopeless situation, that architecture, to build anything, you need a lot, you need people with money or people with power. Mm-hmm. It's not like being a painter in your own, studio. You need that support, that establishment support. So a number of young architects that was in this case called two groups, called Superstudio and Archizoom, started to do what they called trying to verify where the system was going, whether the economic system, the political system was going. And for example, that was the beginning of the age of consumption. The big supermarket, the big discount stores were starting to appear on the landscape, and the European landscape as well. And so Archizoom here started to design what the city of tomorrow was going to look like. In other words, literally like an endless repetition, like your apartment would be not that different from living in a superstore. And so this was, here, the superstores, right? And it was very ironical. It was, but it had an edge to it. And on top of it, they were fantastically beautiful, those drawings. So I was quite fascinated about the ability to do something that was critical and beautiful at the same time. And I'm sure that in a way, there's some relation with the way La Villette was developed, and about that idea that it was about event, about a social relation, yeah.
Perhaps closer to the present period, there were two projects, and we'll quickly, I think, go over this one and spend a little bit more time on the Acropolis Museum, but this project, the Tri-Towers of Babel, which was a response to the events of 9/11, and the Acropolis Museum, which just was completed and inaugurated, both seem to bump up very directly against political events and political circumstances.
Yeah, living in New York during that period was an unusual experience. I think some of you may have been there at that time. I think everyone was traumatized on a lot of levels, and those of us as architects were probably even more traumatized because to witness the attack, it's not only the attack on people, which is of course the most horrible part of it, but it's also an attack on what we do, right? I felt literally a physical suffering of seeing those two towers, you know, collapse. So one took it very, very seriously, and one was very upset about people who saw it as another exercise in form making. And so some of us, look, I'll get very precise, a major newspaper, the New York Times, decided to show examples of what it could look like and asked us to produce, 15 of us or so, to produce images of the new. So on one hand, it was very generous, it was very full of good intentions. To sort of stimulate a discussion of what New York or what a city could look like. But in many cases, it was being oblivious of the political context. And I got extremely upset. Again, I believe that architecture is never separate from social or political circumstances. So I said, well, I'm going to design something, but first I'm going to do something else as well. So here is the proposal, which was after the Twin Towers. They were the Tri-Towers, and they were about several programs and so on. But then saying, hey, what happens if I place this in an idyllic Arcadian context? You read it in one way. What happens if I do it like this, right? Like the city of the war heroes and so on, right? The memorial. Or what happens if it's a sort of Las Vegas? Or what happens if suddenly I put this crowd, as I called it, a city of brotherhood? Every time the building is the same, but the interpretation of the image is different. And that's again another version of what I say when I say that this building is not quite the same as being a bus, you know, parking, or being a school. There is
really
a correlation. Right. But there is a difference, right? Yeah. It doesn't work in the same way.
Perhaps we end with the most recent events. The inauguration of the New Acropolis Museum was in June of this year, and there's been a lot written about the backstory regarding the Elgin marbles, which you house at the top of this building. So I thought it was fitting for several reasons to elaborate on this project maybe a bit more than others. So we have a few images of the Acropolis Museum. And is this the main access point?
There's no main, you should know me well enough, there's no main point of view. Yeah, right. No, in reality,
there is no entrance.
It actually always frustrates people. They don't know what is the front facade, right? Yes, sure, there's an entrance. This is actually a side facade, and amusingly enough, you may see it in other images. I'm not sure what images you brought, but the building is in three parts. On the site of on that site, there's incredible archaeological remnants. So the challenge was, how do you build a building on those archaeological remnants? We may see other images. Then the second challenge, this part, the Parthenon is here, right? And there's nothing between the Parthenon and the museum. Mm-hmm. And if you think that the Parthenon was, or is, the most influential or important building, yeah, here, this picture is perfect. Right? You know, here is the Parthenon, and there's nothing between, you know, the museum and the Parthenon. How do you dialogue between the two? Can you go back now to the first image you had? Yeah, right? And in between, it's the place where all the statues, the incredible collection of archaic statues. So the building is organized in this manner with maybe go to the next one. You have the archaeological, the archaeological remnants. Let's find the archaeological remnants here, right? And glass floors. This is the lobby, and you can see through the glass floor into the archaeological remnants. Here you have this room, which is a large glass rectangle, which is oriented exactly in the same direction as the Parthenon itself, while this part of the building is oriented along the street, the current street, street layout. And so, in other words, I take advantage of our session now to tell people this is not a deconstructivist gesture. It's simply...
you notice the word hasn't come up yet.
It's simply orienting the upper part of the building in the same direction as the Parthenon, so that the light coming on the pediment comes at the same moment in the same direction. Next.
But it seems to be an incredibly loaded statement that you made there, precisely because the Elgin marbles are housed in that top section, and to put them right in line with the Parthenon and parallel to them to reinforce the absence?
Well, okay. You have this here, right? This line correspond exactly to this line. The marbles, the so-called Elgin marbles, that's a frieze, of which half of it, as you all know, is now at the British Museum, and the other half is in Athens, in the museum, right? And so there is a big discussion, an incredibly loud polemic about whether artifacts that were taken 100 years ago or 200 years ago and are now in many museums in the world, at the Louvre or at the Metropolitan, or I'm sure here in San Francisco there's example of this kind, the Getty, not too far away. Yeah. The issue of whether those artifacts should be returned to their homeland. Right. And in this particular case, the Greek wants the frieze to come back, and I totally, approve of that. I consider that the frieze is actually one single piece of artwork. It's not a nationalistic issue. It's one piece of artwork, one sequence, one narrative, and they should be all together. So the concept of the project, and maybe one of the reasons we won the competition, we said we are going to recreate the narrative, right? Yes. And to put it at the top of the building so you can see the fragment of the Parthenon, the fragment that were in the Parthenon at the same time as you're looking at the Parthenon itself, right? So this created, in a sense, can you go back maybe to the previous image? Yes, a situation where you have that dialogue between the two. This image is also interesting. This actually happening in here. That's the so-called archaic gallery, and I wanted to have the possibility of not having the statues in a box, in a room, all in a static situation, but rather talking now back to the very beginning of the work, the idea of the movement in space, the idea of dynamic relation between the viewer and the artwork itself. So establishing, first the relationship between the statues and the columns, as a sort of a first level of dialogue, and then when people move in, you have the dialogue between the visitors and the statues themselves, and you can walk around 360 degrees around these statues. Another thing for those of you who are interested in materials, architecture is also about materiality, is the concrete is slightly sandblasted, so it just absorbs the light, and it's structural, it holds the building together, it's not decorative. And the statues, the marble reflects the light, while the concrete absorbs the light, and it creates a very, very beautiful relation.
It's interesting in looking at the photographs that almost the absence is not just of the pieces of the Elgin marbles that are still in the British Museum. You've left space void in that section of this pediment for the eventuality or the invitation, perhaps, of the return of the Elgin marbles. But it's also striking this void. It goes back to this notion of event and the requirement almost in all of your work of the presence of a human body that almost seems to be missing in these depopulated architectural photographs.
Yes.
Yes. No public. Were these taken before the museum was open?
Yes, yes, of course, of course. The museum at the moment, the museum at the moment has. I was there 2 weeks ago. On that Sunday, there had been 14,000 visitors, and since June they've been 500,000 visitors already. So it gets quite
comes alive.
It gets quite active, quite alive, and quite beautiful. Yes.
Perhaps before we go to questions, we could end just the other side of politics is the corporate sponsor and the image of the corporation, which is such an American narrative in a way in terms of architecture and corporate modernism. But perhaps quickly we could show just some examples of your father's work with three major corporations in Switzerland: the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Laboratories, the Mutuelle Vaudoise Assurance, the insurance company in Lausanne, and finally the Nestlé headquarters in Vevey. Your father was in an era where politics was very on the front boilerplate with working in this interwar period, and at the same time trying to develop a kind of branding strategy for these corporations.
The meaning of words evolves over time and certainly over generation. For the generation that was active after Second World War, politics often meant international politics and the politics of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways the discussion was less to, well, it also had a social dimension. You still had in Europe, not so much in America, but in Europe, you had very active communist parties. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, the discussion was about how to look at architecture as something that could be a common denominator between different countries. And it's quite interesting that it's seen at the time that something called the International Union of Architects was created, of which Jean Tschumi was fairly instrumental. And because people said, well, we have to ensure that peace happens in the world and so on. In many ways, it's interesting to see maybe this first building, you can recognize a certain influence of Perret. Perret was one of the masters who had an influence on Le Corbusier, and because of the use of concrete and prefabrication and so on. But eventually one sees the work of Jean Tschumi developing slightly in a direction which introduces the use of glass, and you can go to the next one, and even more go to the next one, like in Vevey, which is 1956, but is very, very close to some of the things that were being done here in this country. Jean Tschumi competed actually against Eero Saarinen for the World Health Organization building and won that building. In other words, suddenly that was the beginning of international competitions, the beginning of a dialogue over the ocean. And I think that was very, very important, that suddenly one was talking about something that we consider totally banal and normal today, a sort of global conversation of architecture, but at the time, that was the very, very beginning of it.
Fantastic. I think we were going to talk a little bit about institutions, but maybe we'll go straight to the last image so we can have some questions. I bring this last image up just as a sort of final note before we open it up for questions. There's an interesting moment in the monograph by Gilles Leveur, or the non-monograph by Gilles Leveur. The last chapter, which opens with this image of you racing somewhere, going from one airport space to another, and this idea of having bags on both shoulders, and more importantly maybe for us and the students, your pockets full of books. And I wonder, just as a final question, were there any books that you're reading on this trip from New York that one could find perhaps in your carry-on luggage? That you'd like to share?
Oh, absolutely. Just very clearly. Today at
you couldn't buy this one.
Well, yeah, because it was too heavy. However,
it doesn't fit in the pocket.
However, I bought 3 issues of this fairly good or extremely good magazine called Log. It's it's small enough to fit in my pocket.
Perfect.
Right? It's half an inch thick, and it's about 5 by 8 in dimension. And it's yes, indeed I would say that we are in a great moment now. Is that because there is a little less work out there, architects are trying to think again.
Thinking's always good.
Good.
Thank you very much.